AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.
All right, Gary, we're going to learn something about software on today's show.
We are absolutely going to learn something. We're going to learn a lot about a lot beyond software. We're going to learn about changes that companies need to make if they want to be competitive. And they really need to make a lot of changes, I think. So
we've got Scott Tobin from a company called Envorso. Did I say that right? Envorso?
You did.
Okay,
Envorso.
good. And we got Keith Naughton back from Bloomberg. And great to have the both of you guys here on the
Thanks
show.
for having me.
Thanks, John.
Envorso elevator pitch.
Well, that's a good one. The genesis of Envorso was really this whole inflection point moving to the software-defined vehicle. But not only that, I mean, every kind of traditional hardware company you can think of is moving to becoming more software-defined. And, you know, I think Tesla started the software-defined vehicle back in 2012, if my memory's right. And I think the real inflection point in the industry came later in the late 2010s, and everybody's now working on it. So our founder, Adrian Belfour, kind of saw this opportunity to say, hey, how can we bring West Coast tech know-how and combine it with, you know, the core software skills of the auto industry, which are strong in some elements, whereas the West Coast guys bring other elements and get 1 and 1 to equal 3. So at Envorso, we started this company to go help mainly Midwest industrials move their progress and their capabilities in software, and particularly around software-defined vehicles or products, you know, much more quickly, make fewer mistakes, get the lessons learned, and also learn how to integrate the talent that they need to bring in from other industries.
Well, clearly the industry needs this kind of help. Everybody's struggling on it. But Scott, you mentioned it, so Toyota or Tesla came out with it in 2012. They came out with it then.
Yeah.
They were obviously working on it before that. Why has it taken the rest of the industry more than a decade to move on this?
Yeah. Well, the quick answer is it's really hard. And Tesla's, you know, I've got all the respect in the world for Tesla and Elon and all the great things he's done. But, you know, they got away with a few mistakes that the traditional guys wouldn't have got away with. But like I said, the Model S came out in 12, and by about the the late teens, it kind of was viewed as a success. And the industry had to start moving toward this software-defined vehicle. The other thing I would say, and we should talk about, so what's out there now? If we need to get to software-defined vehicle, what's out there now? And that's a distributed, right, control network. And there's so much resource to manage a distributed network. It's not easy to just cut off working on that and walk over to what you really need to do in SDV. It needs to be done, John. It's not to be competitive. I think it's for survival, because if you continue to grow this 100 ECU, CAN networked, multiple branches of software, hundreds of millions of lines of code, you're going to fall over. It's just not sustainable. Not to mention you don't have the resources for it, and all the resources it's sucking away from developing new products. So I think they're having a hard time. You know, the startups have done it.
Well, because they got to start from scratch, right? No legacy, nothing to haul along with
limited product lineup, no technical debt. I'm not saying it's still hard. I compliment them too, but they were 100% focused on that. Now there's other shortfalls the startups have that we can talk about too, but that's in essence.
Well, I think we should point out to the audience that you spent 25 years at Ford, so you're not some guy who's from the West Coast to
29 and a half, actually. But
okay, and you know, so you know, I think we all met you there when you were at Ford, and your last assignment was basically leading product development and engineering at Lincoln when the brand was undergoing huge changes. So, I mean, you know what it is to develop a vehicle. So when you're talking about software-defined vehicles, you know, you've had a lot of skin in the game.
Yeah, I mean, I've been blessed. I've had a great career. I loved my time at Ford and Lincoln, and you know, worked in. We were just talking about it. You know, I was in Germany for a while. I was in England for a while. I was in Japan, working with Mazda, who I have a ton of respect for. So yeah, lots of. But coming back to Envorso, what we did is we went out and got a handful of guys that have deep automotive knowledge. Probably done a couple of 100 vehicle programs between us, and then brought in some really truly amazing software expertise. I mean, I'm talking the guy that founded Xbox. We've got the the Ludo Haudick, my CTO, was prior to this was the vice president of AI for Meta. I mean, these are the truly strong software leaders who have come together to say, hey, how can we help people move more quickly with higher quality, with the right tools and processes and the right talent?
What's their interest coming to automotive?
You know, actually, I get the question often, well, how did you do that? You know, how did you get those guys to come together? And I'd love to say I'm charming and persuasive, but I'm not. Really, we kind of got it started, and then they recruited themselves. So these are guys that had, and gals, by the way, that have had their careers. They've done big things. They've been well compensated, and now they genuinely just want to work on cool stuff. And bringing this software defined, bringing we should talk about what the West Coast guys do well and what the automotive guys do well, because they're not the same and they're both important. And they both have to compromise with each other to make it work. But yeah, so it kind of perpetuated stuff, and we have a crazy good lineup of people, and they're not consultants who studied other people doing it. They're the team that did it, and that's what I try to tell our clients. These are the guys that did it. Let them come in and help you. They've made the mistakes. There's an old saying. My son's football coach always said, "It's great to learn by your mistakes, but it's even better to learn by somebody else's mistakes."
So Scott, I had my first ride in a Cybertruck this week, and there's lots of things you can nitpick about the Cybertruck, but boy, its screen is next level. It's like nothing you see on any other car. While some of the leading high quality legacy name brands still have screens blanking out as you drive down the road, this thing is, I'd love to just watch football on it. It's so beautiful. You can move the vehicle around, you can do everything. Why are they still so far out in front?
Well, that because they've got that whole software defined vehicle, we haven't talked about kind of what is a software defined vehicle, but one of the things is it's frankly actually less complex. It sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? But so with that nailed, they've been able to perfect the IVI, the in-vehicle infotainment, which is just a part of software defined vehicle. Right. That's just one subset. But yeah, those, they're very software oriented, and that in the software industry is what really leads in screens and
but everything, the camera images were sharper. Everything about it was better.
They're processing that quicker, faster, more efficiently.
Right.
So what is the software defined vehicle?
Okay, well, I kind of have, sorry, it's going to be long, but I have a 5-point answer to that. But because I hear that, in fact, we were at SAE this week, and that question was asked a number of times, and there's lots of different answers, and none of them were wrong, but I think the complete answer is, first of all, you decouple the software from the hardware. And I think that's probably everybody knows that. And in the name, the second thing is, so you decouple the two. So the software, right now, a module comes into the plant, the software's burned onto it, you put the module in the car, you can network it together.
So this would be like a window switch, or?
Somewhat. There's an abstraction layer that decouples the hardware or the software from most of it decouples the application software from the rest of the system. Then the software, the second criteria is the software defines the experience, right? The software is what the customer is interacting with. It defines the customer experience, and that's what he's talking about. Gosh, the camera was better, the screen was so clear. That's the software defining that. And the hardware helps. Obviously the car doesn't run without hardware, but decoupled, defining the experience, then it's updatable. It's alive. It doesn't leave the dealership and it's done. Like back in the day, you'd leave the dealership, it was done. Or you had to bring that thing in the dealer, tear it apart, pull that module out I talked about, and put a new one in at great expense. And that was the only way you could change software. So this can be updatable. It can be updatable. It can be upgradable. Hopefully you're just adding features and making it more awesome. But we all know that sometimes you have to fix things that went wrong too, right? And then there's the whole revenue stream that can come, right? You can offer things that people might even want to pay for. And that's a discussion all in of itself.
Actually, I just have a story out today about Ford Pro, Ford's commercial unit. Mm-hmm. They've had a great success selling software. They have 500,000 customers already for that. But the dream seemed to be a few years ago that retail consumers would be ordering their Starbucks and their pizzas, and we'd just be doing commerce from the car, and it was this all-in-one utopia that we would ride around in. That has not been realized.
Yeah.
Why not? Why does it work on the commercial end and not the consumer end?
Yeah. I think that that's probably one I'm not an expert in, but I would argue that people don't want to feel like they're paying for something they should have had anyway, right? I mean, Tesla does do it. They offer upgrades and features that, some of them were I think some of them were $2,000.
Well, FSD, it was up to 15 grand. It's down from that now.
Yeah.
But Keith, I think part of it is if I can do something on my phone, I'm not going to do it in my car.
Or I'm not going to pay to do it in my car.
Right. So if automakers want people to subscribe for some sort of service in their car, it's got to be something that only the car can offer. That's my opinion.
I agree. I think
if it's going to be done on your phone, I don't think the automakers have a chance in selling subscriptions.
But the commercial guys need like telematics.
They do.
They need things that the consumer don't. But I mean, I think that's a great question. I agree. I do think though, let's keep. Once you get that, it's kind of like one of those things like, in the old days before we worked with computers as engineers, is, don't make him prove he needs a computer, give him one and you'll discover all these awesome things you can do. I think once we get an SDV in place, then more better ideas will come out on how to drive revenue.
Well,
perhaps.
So does
but I only got to 3, by the way.
Oh yeah. Let's hear the next 2.
But no, just to finish it, like I said, but the next one I think is really important, and it goes back. Is you got to build this. Remember, I talked about the decoupled layer. It's alive. It's changing. It's defining the customer experience. But you got to build it on a simpler, an efficient, stable set of hardware. And that 100+ number of ECUs I talked about, that's unsustainable. It's almost unmanageable. I kind of equate it to you can cut your grass with a pair of scissors. You can do it, but it just is not a good way to go, right? So get a lawnmower, right? Get this is where you come into, design a couple CPUs, CPUs, zonals, domain controllers. I don't know the right number. There is no right answer. Depends on your situation, but it's somewhere at less than 10 probably, or 12.
So you're talking about what I've heard talked about in the industry, zonal centralized computing.
Yeah, it's I call it the architecture. It's the zonal, exactly. Zonal, it's a couple CPUs that are talking to zonal controllers, maybe a domain controller, if you want to have maybe a domain controller for ADAS or something like that. But the point is, it's this now much more simplified, and you can then update. That enables those updates. If you got 100 modules you got to chase around for to try to update through a CAN, it's not going to work. It's not physically possible. I got war stories on that that we tried to do, and sometimes we succeeded. The things you hear about today, a lot of times they're updating IVI and things like that. So you got to build it on a stable set of hardware. And then the last tick is just that then there's data, right? You've got access to, and I know all the sensitivities around data. That's a whole separate show probably, John. But the good news is, Ludo Haudik, the colleague I mentioned that came from Meta, he said, the automotive guys, he said, I think they're actually farther behind in data than they are software. And he didn't mean that critically. He said, they like data. They see it as a means to an end. He said, but the Amazons and the Apples, these mega companies, data's a religion. He said it's what everything serves. That's the words he used. He said it's how they grew to know their customers better than their customers know themselves, and it's how they just made more and more value for their customers. I mean, they're using data for their customers in a good way. And but this software-defined vehicle now enables you, whether you elect to do it and how you elect to use it is still to be determined, but at least now you can.
Okay, how do you think that increasing data flow will affect actually automotive design? Ford decided to delete their automatic self-parking feature because people weren't using it, and they got that from the data. So what's that writ large?
I think, the data then informs the design.
Right.
So that example, I'm very familiar with it. They used the data to say, hey, how many people are using this feature?
Right.
And they we're finding out not very many. Low. So we're giving it away, and it's a bad decision. Now, wouldn't it have been nicer to know that before you engineered and launched it? So they saved a few bucks, but they saved variable cost a year and a half down the road or 2 years down the road. They could have saved it up front.
So how would the software-defined vehicle allow that to happen, though? I mean, how would you be able to predict consumer behavior?
I guess I'm not saying in that example, but if you have this rich leveraged data source, you kind of know what people will use, and you can research it. But I'll give you an example. When they used to launch the next version of Windows, they had like a 60,000 person pilot fleet, group of people out there that they would send the prototype out to, and by keystroke they actually knew what functions did these people actually use and which not.
Interesting.
And they tested it like that. And now that'd be more difficult to do with a car. You can't give 60,000 people a car to drive around. But something to that, simulators, research. That's what he was saying, is that your example was they're doing that, and they're also trying to do predictive maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of the two that I've seen that are really really valuable. But there's I think a lot of more customer insight. And Doug Field spoke this morning. I went down to see him at the SAE show, and he talked about kind of designing inside out. Instead of doing this linear, we make a clay, we stick a screen in it, then the screen gets sourced, and then eventually a coder starts to do software. He said, no, the software has to be talked about while we're building the clay, right?
Or even before.
Or even, probably before.
So why is everybody struggling with this? We've seen, I'll pick on a few companies here. Volkswagen started this software group called Cariad. Oh my gosh, has it been a disaster for them? Looks like they're starting to put it together now. General Motors has had all kinds of problems launching its EVs that is all software related. And I just mentioned those two, but as you know, everybody's struggling with this. And it seems to me, particularly for the legacies, is they still have a legacy mindset of how you do product development, PD, and software doesn't fit into it that way.
Yeah. I mean, before I answer the question, it's even, the PD guys have that, but there's all these other, within traditional guys, less so the startups. And because we work with the silicon chip guys and the startups and the OEMs, we have a pretty good view, and the tier ones, we have a pretty good view of who's doing what and what works and what hurdles they're hitting. But in these big companies, I can tell you firsthand because of my experience, there's a whole purchasing machine you have to get through. There's a whole finance management machine, HR. I mean, it's really hard. Firstly, SDVs are hard. I make them sound, throw a couple CPUs in and some zonals and snap your fingers and abstraction layer and it's done. It's really hard. And I think they're struggling for a couple reasons. And what we try to advocate is, break it down. First, you got to look at your talent and your people, right? And this where you can talk about bringing in some of this. Not that there's core software guys in the industry that are brilliant, and they're particularly brilliant around regulation and safety. And we're putting our children in these cars. They deserve our absolute firm regard for safety, no question. And these guys are great at that, right? But the tech industry brings this rapid innovation, this really strong platform with abstracted properly, and the ability to seamlessly update through time and data, and they're data pros, right? So if you can put the two of those together, make 1 + 1 = 3, that's the guys that are going to win. That's what we try to advocate. So that's talent. Then there's tools. Just like you guys have all probably been in 100 assembly plants or more, right? There's a software factory, and it has to run, and it has to run efficiently, and it has to be put together, just like a real assembly plant. It can't have a bunch of spur lines shooting off the side. You can't not know what parts are, and you have to test, and you have to test repeatedly. They can launch a version of Windows every 6 weeks. You got to have how long does it take for a new developer to release code? What is your test coverage on your code? Those are the process tool chain pieces. Who's really checking code into GitHub? Is 10% of your team checking code into GitHub? If that's true, you're in trouble. 90% of your team should be checking. That means you got more checkers and trackers than you got doers, which is kind of a chronic issue in the industry, right?
I talked to one guy that's truly a software genius out in Silicon Valley, German guy actually, and his message to Detroit, I think Detroit is a euphemism for all legacies, right?
We say West Coast, Detroit.
But so he said, stop all this outsourcing to low-cost countries. He said, you're not getting your money's worth out of it. He said, essentially what you want are my words, not his, software studs.
Yeah.
Who really know, and you pay them $1 million each, because what you're going to get out of it is much better than all this offshoring stuff that you're going to have to go back and fix. The other thing he said, and I'd like to get your response to both of these, was he said, the way Detroit does it, i.e. legacies, is they write out all the software and then they assemble it all together and start testing and then start finding problems. And he says, that's the wrong way. At the end of every day,
Yes.
you put everything together that you've done and you start testing right then and there, and you find the bugs immediately. So what do you think? Software studs, do it in slices?
He's 1,000. Everything you just said is 1,000% right. In fact, so here's, I came out of the industry, right? So this is what my West Coast tech team has taught me. The traditional knowledge was, if I got 10 engineers, I can do this much. And if I got 15 engineers, I can do 50% more, right? That was kind of our mechanical engineering. And it wasn't far off, right? In the software industry, if you can get what they call a 10X guy, you'd rather have rather have the right 10 software guys than the wrong 100 software guys. In fact, I'll tell a story. We went out to CES. This is years ago. And back then we were talking about a digital owner's manual. And I won't say who I was with because I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but we were talking to the potential supplier, and we were in some suite. You've been there, John, in CES. And we wanted a prototype. And I said, well, how long do you think it'll take to get a prototype? And he said, one guy, 30 days. Yeah, about a month we'll get a prototype. And our jaws dropped. One guy, 30 days. In our budgeting process, we've never had one. And he looks at us, he says, well, I could put 2 guys on it, but then it would take 2 months.
Perfect.
So that's your guy's point. So get them, pay them. I mean, there's some, again, I won't name names, but there's some of these support organizations who say, no, here's the limit for what you can pay a developer. That's the rule. That is the thickest thinking ever, right? Get the right people. In fact, we have in Envorso, we have our own dev team internally, and I've learned this lesson. Now I have a team since Ludo came on board. It's half the size, and it does not 10 times as much, probably 50 times as much.
I wonder though, is it just personnel? Because your former employer has been the most recalled automaker in the last 3 years. Quality seems to be an issue. They just had 60,000 F-150s parked around Detroit because it turned out to be a software glitch. Is software introducing a whole new, very difficult stream of quality problems, just as the industry maybe figured out fit and finish over the last several decades? Yeah. Is this our new fit and finish bugaboo?
First thing I want to say, my former employer is awesome, by the way. I want to make that clear.
Noted.
But that's why you got to move to SDV. The answer is yes, software. But so the numbers, right? If you want to go to awards, my colleague Todd Warren just recently wrote two articles on your very question. And so last year, I think 15% of the recalls, about 6 million units were affected by software recalls. Mm-hmm. And about 60% of those had to go to the dealer, right? And I think the biggest one was the Tesla Autopilot one. I think that was, how many vehicles were that? 2 million?
Yep, 2 million.
So there's a huge issue around quality, but I would argue that with the software-defined vehicle, you're going to improve quality because one, you can over-the-air update it. It's simple. It's less of a monster. But this whole, I didn't hit your second point, John, which is, submit your code every day, run your simulator. If you got those disciplines, those recalls will go down. But the way the architecture is architected now, it's really a lot harder to do. It's cutting the grass with the scissors. You can do it, but it's a lot harder. So I think I'm optimistic about the industry's ability here. It's slow, but I think from a quality perspective, software is going to be, it's always going to be problematic. And, there was software guys say, the traditional guys would say, when are you going to give me bug-free software? And the software guys just go, there is no bug-free software. There is no such thing. But you got to hold the line like a crazy man on the safety and stuff, and push the limits on the other stuff.
Scott, you mentioned when we buy a car, we're basically buying hardware, right? So when we're doing development, so let's say Keith is the guy who's in charge of infotainment, and John does chassis, and I do HVAC, and you do safety, right? So we're each going to be developing something, and when we're developing these things, we're each going to have our own ECUs that are part of this.
Right.
So how does the development change such that software plays a bigger role, and at what point does it play that role?
Yeah, I think that's another thing Doug mentioned this morning was if you're not careful, you'll see the org chart in your product.
I love that.
Yeah, and we've used that expression too, and it's and that's kind of because I think in the scenario you just described would be the old architecture, right? Everybody's got their own ECU because that's what it was. I was a vehicle line director for years, and a supplier would come in and say, "Hey, look, I want to show you this." And God, look at it, and I don't know, headlight aiming or blind spot monitoring or auto air refresh we were talking about. And I said, yeah, I want that. And let's do it. And my customer would love that. But then in they come with their own module, their own sensors, their own software, often black box. And you can't get, and because I think what you're meaning is how do you integrate this agile development synergistically as you build the software? And that is the magic. And that's what we can help you with. No, it's hard. It really is. But I think, obviously, I could get down in the weeds on specifications and, understanding the customer first, start with the customer always, what's the feature got to do and then work your way back. But yeah, there's too much siloed work, and it's not just siloed. I mean, that's not people unwilling to work together. It's, it's literally outsourced to Bosch or Delphi or somebody, and they're doing it, and it's their proprietary code, and they hand it to you. Jim Farley talked about this. I can't even see some of the code, let alone write it all. So they need to bring more of it in house, and that's a debate on how much that. I know there's some benchmarks. One startup believes like kind of everything controlled by the CPU we want to do, and then some of the peripheral stuff we can outsource. That's not a bad logic, but it's not the only logic. But I think, did I answer your question?
Well, but I mean, isn't the status quo basically that there are these independent silos and that people come together at some point in the development program and then they say, okay, now my unit has to talk to your unit, who has to talk to his unit, and so on. I mean,
but if you're doing the tool chain right, you're all checking that software every night and it's running through the simulator, and the test code comes out, and you know where your disconnects are, and then you go work on those, and then tomorrow you do it again. And you get better. It's called continuous development.
But that's the ideal, right?
That's the solution. No, that's not what happens necessarily in some places today. That's why there's help needed. And it's not, again, I don't think it's anybody ill-willed. It's just they're working on what they work on. They don't know what the other guy's working on. And then they bring it together on a hardware in the loop bench or at TT prototype. And by then it's, in fact, here's another great advantage of software-defined vehicle. Not very long ago, they'd say 6 months before job one, we're dropping pencils on the software because we're going to start building. And so not only do you lose the 6 months from final engineering judgment to job one, you lose the 2 to 3 months from job one to okay to ship, right? So there's 9 months of really good engineering. And in the electronics world, you have 2 generations of products gone in and out. And we got you, then if you come up with something, say, oh, that's going to be at the model year. Software-defined vehicle, you get a buildable, safe product, and the developers continue to develop during that whole time span. Think about that. That's almost another 25% of program time. Mm-hmm. Or you could take it out of the back end and start those guys later.
I wonder, you gave that good example earlier about Microsoft testing out its latest, OS on 60,000 people. I mean, isn't that what Elon does with beta FSD? Mm-hmm. So is that where the industry should eventually go, testing out new software on its users?
It could. Yeah, it could.
What's the risk reward there?
Well, the only constraint is that if you couldn't add a feature that required hardware. But if you were doing software only driven feature, yeah, you could have how many Chevy enthusiasts or Mustang enthusiasts or Corvette enthusiasts are out there that would just love to sign up to say, yeah, give me the early, and I'll write you a whole letter back on it, right? I mean, yeah. So I think the answer is, yeah, why not? The only thing is if it was a hardware, a lot of times, so for some of the bigger changes, you'd need a piece of hardware. How you pilot those, would have to think some more.
Well, and with FSD, there was obviously a safety component.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good. Hey, look, we got to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back and talking more about news in the industry. But first, a shout out to our great sponsor, Bridgestone.
when the peace and quiet of your morning commute is as comforting as your morning macchiato. That's what really matters. Bridgestone Turanza EV tires. Less noise for more quiet comfort.
All right, we're back. So, Mr. Vasilash, I'm sure you've got some topics you'd like us to dive into.
Well, since we've last been on, Tesla made the announcement that it's going to be trimming a significant number of people from its staff around the world. We've been talking a lot about Tesla, and so, Scott, if you can, I mean, how does a company eliminate 10% of its people and still work? I mean, so, you know, if you're back at company X and 1 out of 10 guys is gone, I mean, how do you do that?
And just to put a real number to that, Tesla's 140,000 people. So 14,000 people out the door. 10% sounds low when you think of it in retail, but 14,000 people. And it may be even higher than that.
And to put that in perspective, Rivian's total employment is 16,000.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that's almost like sending an entire Rivian company out the door.
Out the door.
Boy, when you say it like that, it's frightening.
Yeah.
This isn't your question, but if Elon explained what he did when he bought, you said X, but Twitter, right? Because 50% of the people were actually working on what he wanted them to anyway. So that was easy, right? How do you do it in a place? I mean, Tesla seems like a pretty efficient company already. It's tough choices, and I think using the tools, right? Getting broader, more efficient use of tools, and getting more of those 10X guys we talked about would be how I would approach it. But yeah, that's a big number. That's all. When you say like a whole Rivian walking out of Tesla, that really puts it in perspective.
Puts it in perspective. And it wasn't just, the 10%, the 14,000. They lost a couple of key execs too.
They did.
Who resigned. We don't know why.
Top engineer guy.
Drew Baglino, who's been, one of the key guys at the company, now look, he's probably made $100 million off the stock and everything like that, and may have just decided, you know what, I'm going to put my feet up. But it makes you wonder what's going on inside.
Well, and of course, there is speculation that seems to increasingly appear accurate that Model 2, the cheap EV, is at least on ice.
Struggling.
And so, maybe that's how you get rid of 14,000 people. How many do you have working on that?
Yeah. You hate to take it out of the product plan, though. But yeah, that is the other way. But an executive from a different startup who left, just on your theory on the executives, I talked to him and he said, I love the company. It's been the dream job. He goes, but I haven't seen my wife in 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, they work
they work like dogs.
Subhuman levels. I mean, and seriously, that was I just can't, I mean, I'd love to do more, but I have to go.
Yeah. Well, the aforementioned Rivian announced 1% cut today.
Correct.
And in February, that was a 10% cut.
Right.
So I wonder, so Keith, do you think that some of the guys around here are going to say, if these companies are able to cut this many people, maybe we should start thinking about that?
I actually think just the opposite. If I'm Ford and I'm trying to develop my own competitor for cheap Chinese EVs, and I see that Tesla just let go all the people that were doing that task at Tesla, I'd hire as many of those people as I could and send them out to California where Ford's doing its cheap EV and have them go to work. They have less than 100 people working on that right now. They need more. I'd be snapping up resumes quickly on all these Tesla. That's a lot of talent on the street.
But remember what's driving all these price cuts. They're not hitting their revenue,
right?
Which means they've got to cut costs some way to meet the guidance that they gave to Wall Street. So it's all financially driven. It wasn't like all of a sudden these companies have said, we got too many people.
And it's interesting how it's flipped, John. So being EV only was a virtue, right? Because that was the future.
Yeah.
Now being EV only is a vice because you have nowhere else to turn other than draconian cuts, right? You have no hybrids. You have no ICE vehicles that make money for you. If you're Rivian especially, you have nothing that makes money for you.
Well, in the early adopters who were jonesing for an EV are kind of got their choices now, and many of them got them. So that's slowing down. There is definitely it's going to come back. I think there's definitely a place for EVs, and they're going to succeed. I firmly believe that. But
totally agree. I keep saying in 3 years we're going to have next generation everything, next generation platforms, next generation batteries. There's going to be public charging stations all over the place.
John McElroy, techno optimist.
Yes, yes, he is.
All right. So Keith mentioned in passing the Irvine, California Skunk Works that Ford has, which John also loves very much. And okay, so let me put it to you, and let's ask this in the context of traditional, not in terms of Ford, just in terms of what you know of the industry, the traditional players in the industry. So someone comes up with an idea that is as revolutionary as Tesla's unboxed approach to manufacturing, which can, reduce the footprint of a plant by 40% or more, and save tons of money. Culturally, is there a willingness to change as much as they need to change in order to keep pace with Chinese manufacturers, as well as with Tesla, as well as with some of the EV startups?
I don't think they have a choice, but that doesn't mean they'll do it, right? But you hit on a couple little things. I think the concept of taking a team, like I think actually, if I was a traditional OEM and I wanted to do an SDV, I would create a separate standalone team that with someone I trust running it. They can tap on the rest of the company, but they don't get interfered with, and they don't get this distraction. And I think, so that's the benefit we talked about with the startups, right? As far as the cultural change and the fear of the Chinese, it's very legitimate. I mean, the stuff the Chinese are making and the price points are impressive. And so I think some approach like that, I mean, they tried it with Saturn how many years ago and it failed. But I think an approach like that isn't a bad idea. And there may be some consolidation is another way. Some of these, I don't think all these nameplates will be around in 5 years. I could name some, but
Go for it.
well, you know who they are. I mean, there's Lucid, there's Rivian, there's Tesla, there's Canoo, there's whomever, is it Faraday?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, will all of them be around in 5 years? I don't know.
I think Tesla will.
They will. And with the Charger score, I mean, that just cemented. That was a brilliant move to get the industry using the Chargers. But they got to change. They got to win. And there may be some protections that help them with time. But we got to be globally competitive. Period.
And how do the Chinese do it? How can BYD have a sub $10,000 Seagull, which John did a great.
If I knew
review
the
of.
answer to that,
it can't just be labor costs, right? It's not just labor costs, Scott. It's more than that, right?
Yeah, I would only
be process.
I would only be speculating. But I did work a fair amount in China, and back to we talked about the engineers are very good, and they work like dogs, but they're crazy fast.
Well, your Nautilus is a Chinese EV. Mm-hmm. So what did you learn through that process?
I didn't do that project.
Okay.
I didn't. I'm 5 years out, so I have to give my successor the credit for that. So, but we did, we learned a lot over there, and it wasn't just full products. There was a lot of infotainment stuff that was learned. But it's they're scary fast. But I mean, it's nothing new. They got a supply base. They do have labor. Labor works long and hard, and it's cheaper. And they're innovative. They're smart, and they have some sometimes unscrupulous methods as to gain competitive advantage.
One thing I heard about BYD too is that it's got essentially 2 engineering teams that work 12-hour shifts. Yeah. So 12 hours. It's 24 cycle.
Right.
And I learned this from suppliers who were trying to do business with them, and they told me we can't keep up with these guys.
Yeah, no, don't underestimate that. It's a huge resource benefit, but that doesn't explain the piece cost.
Right.
Because your point was $10,000, really?
Right.
So, I mean, I wrote a piece myself, a thought piece on EVs not very long ago. And one of the things I talked about in it was, the precious metals that we need and the mining and the whole concept of EV and the environmental benefit is, I think there is an environmental benefit, but it might not be all what we think it is when you look at how many mines. But, where are the precious metals coming from? The Chinese have a handle on graphite, for example. And they're restricting it. They're restricting the export of it. So it's a little bit about who's got the metal, because the battery in an EV, the battery cost is is the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, and
Right.
one other thing about BYD, it's very vertically integrated, even more vertically integrated than Tesla is.
Yeah.
So, which means huge capex up front, right? But then you don't have to pay your suppliers any profits
That's
because
that's
you're
a great
pocketing
point,
it.
and they get a lot of state help.
I was just going to say, let's not leave the Chinese government
No,
out of that
they-
vertical integration.
They want to
Yeah,
win.
That's a part
They
of
want to
it.
win, and they pay for it.
Yeah.
You know, and you think about it, Volkswagen was long very vertically integrated, making everything, and fuel tanks and whatnot, and
Toyota too. Toyota's fairly vertically integrated.
but Volkswagen didn't do as good a job on that, and we're highly
Right.
criticized.
Well, like I
for
said, it takes huge capital investments.
Yeah.
I mean, if
But
you're
you're-
making your seats and your headlamps and your bumper moldings and your glass, and you got to pay for that.
Right. No, your point's brilliant because if you can put the capital in up front, fully accounted, we don't know what that 10,000 is, right? That could be variable, or is it fully accounted, right? So
just to put some numbers on it, GM and Ford spend about $8 billion a year capex. Volkswagen, Stellantis, they're paying $12 billion a year capex. BYD's doing $19 billion. Last year was $19 billion. So huge amount of money.
you can always trade variable cost for investment. So with cheap labor, high tech, borrowed technology, and unlimited capital investment, yeah, you can make up.
And engineers who work around the clock.
Right.
Well, Keith mentioned earlier, the portfolio, the powertrain portfolio, and a good part of your career you're working in powertrain. Do you see that it's advantageous for companies to be able to offer ICE, plug-ins, regular hybrids, and perhaps electric vehicles?
Oh, I mean, that was Keith's point.
Right, but I mean, is
Absolutely. Right now, for sure. I mean, it's only a personal opinion that, there's going to be ICE vehicles around longer than all of us. Don't kid yourself. And that's that's okay. I still think the majority of the fleet, especially the small car fleet, can move. But yeah, having a variety of choices. I mean, hybrids, we always talked about those as, they're inefficient. I mean, when we really think about it, the
Two
beauty,
powertrains.
yeah, you're building in two powertrains, and you give up a lot of interior package to do it, and weight and so on. But you get rid of range anxiety, and you do deliver some degree of the benefits of electrification. So for now, I think PHEVs are really good. And yeah, the good old fashioned ICE is going to continue to roll. But I think we can, especially, the commercial truck space and places like that. I mean, there's some of the heavy truck guys that are putting CNG engines on board to charge battery, running the truck on battery charged by CNG engines. That's an interesting solution. I mean, the irony is we were doing, what am I thinking of? LPG.
Yeah.
Propane. Sorry. Propane and CNG, back in the 90s.
Long
And
time
they were
ago.
damn good cars.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty
They
clean.
really were.
And propane's dirt cheap.
It is, yeah. It's petroleum based, but only by 10. It's way less. So there are solutions in there that, like Doug Field talked about autonomy, for example, today, and they talked about L4 and L5, and why did you kind of settle back to L3? And he's like, well, do you want the perfect solution in 20 years, or do you want a really good solution next year, right? And I think that, as we transition to electrification, if we can be a little rational about it, we can get there. But edicting things, edicting customer preferences is not going to work.
But here's something.
Probably over my skis on that one.
Well, but no, to that point though, the thinking 18 months ago when Ford had its investor day was, we specialize in big. That's what we do well.
Yeah.
So we're going to electrify 3-row SUVs. We're going to electrify pickup trucks. We're going to electrify big because that's what we do. But guess what? That takes a big battery, which costs a lot of money, which never gets you to a price point that the mass market can afford.
That's right.
So now they've 180'd and said, no, you know what? We do small. We're going to do that really well.
Yeah.
So it feels to me like Detroit still hasn't figured out where they fit in the EV future.
Yeah.
Well, I would say it goes beyond Detroit. I mean, this is true pretty much the world over, with the exception of China, probably. But, EV sales just took a nosedive in Europe last month. And I think everyone's struggling with this. And, it kind of is like, if you go back 6, 7 years ago, the outlook for autonomous vehicles was like right around the corner. Everyone's going to have it. And then to get those last 2% of edge cases was like, wow, this is really hard to do.
Right.
I still believe it's coming. It just hasn't come as fast. Same with EVs. You go back a year and a half, 2 years ago. Wow, everyone wants an EV, and the industry invested accordingly. Well, it invested too much, really.
Yeah.
And they ran out of early adopters, pretty much.
Mhm.
And I still think there will be a resurgence, but it's going to take a few years to get there.
But to your point, Keith, thinking about it, I'm not disagreeing with the point by any means, but the way you think about it is if a guy's buying a $80,000 SUV and you tell him it's $120,000, he might say that's a lot more money, and I'll buy it. But down at the $20,000, if you make it $30,000, now all of a sudden you just priced yourself out of somebody's budget.
Correct.
And so, that's why some of the products you see are at the high end, because they can deliver the attributes, and the attributes are worth the revenue.
Right.
So that's what I said. This customer demand has to be there, and the cost has to come down.
Which means
and
we got to
you have
get past the show ponies for rich people.
Yeah, that's
right?
right. That's right. To get mass adoption.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, what's a Model 3 go for?
I want to say right now, and I know there'll be people in the chat room, 37,000, something like that, 35 to 37,000. I think they've got the price down. This is before any, tax rebate credit.
And the Mach-E is now under.
Well, what do you
40.
think is the price point at which the small car EV can start to?
It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be 25,000. That seems incredibly low to me.
I think 30 was my kind of number.
But there is actually a BYD, mid-size SUV that sells for about 31,000 in Australia, and it's very well equipped.
Yeah,
that seems like an ideal car for the
that would-
United States.
That would go. That would work.
It's not just cheap, right? It's got to be an EV that meets what people want. So like people complain, well, there's no affordable cars anymore. Well, yeah, there are. There's a lot of affordable cars, but they're not the cars that most people want to buy.
Right.
Except for the Maverick. Which
Maverick's off to the races, but that is a
selling like
vehicle that people
hotcakes.
want to buy.
Very affordable, though.
Exactly right.
So you can do affordable and desirable in the same package.
Well, look, you can buy a Nissan Versa, or could, under $20,000. It doesn't sell very well because that's not the kind of car most people want.
Well,
the Maverick hit on a lot of needs for people, not just wants, but needs.
Well, of the perennial best-selling car, the Camry, they announced today the pricing. Now the next generation Camry will be all hybrid.
Only hybrid, yeah.
And, we talk on this show a lot about the importance of scale. Okay. So the new Camry base model hybrid will start at $28,400, which is $400 cheaper than the outgoing.
Yeah.
And outgoing, and arguably.
And I just tossed another powertrain in there for you for less.
Well, I mean, and arguably the thing is that you have, you don't have to make different flavors. You're making hybrids.
Right.
That's it, right? So you get the scale.
Cost of complexity comes out.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so to the point of an affordable car that people want, well, it seems to me that Toyota's been doing that for some time now.
But Toyota got crucified for leaning so heavily into hybrids and not into pure EVs.
They look clever now, don't they?
They sure do, don't they?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's been not a new trend for Toyota. They've been doing that for 20 years.
Of course. Yeah.
But the thing we should talk about is the charging. How many of you have spent time at a public charging station?
It's awful.
I have.
That is I spent some time out in Casa Grande in Arizona, and believe it or not, it's kind of funny. The Walmart has the charging bank, and all the BMWs and Teslas and Rivians are pulling into the Walmart to charge. And half the chargers don't work.
Right.
And then people are fighting over the other half, and it takes too long, and so there's a lot to be sorted out on that. A lot.
Agree.
I'm not sure where all the funding went, but it didn't actually make very many chargers. I can tell you that.
Well, we just ran a report today that there's one fast charging station in the United States right now for every 15 gas stations. So that's starting to get to be a ratio that's going to be very manageable. And like I keep saying, in 3 years, I believe the picture is going to change dramatically.
Have you been to a Buc-ee's?
I have not. We don't have any of them in Michigan, to my knowledge.
Oh, you got to go to a Buc-ee's. That you just need to do
I've heard all about it.
Oh my Lord. And I just look at this row I mean, never counted them, but there's easily 100 fuel pumps in a row. Not to mention you can go to the bakery and do 100 other things. But that's the kind of thing you need to electrify, is something like that. And they're at all the main points down I-75 once you get south of Ohio, by the way. But it's an incredible thought. But if you also then go do the math on the power required, it's astounding. It's a small city. It will be a small city. I have a friend. We have an advisor in Envorso's board that ran Autel, the Chinese group, and now runs. They just changed their name, but they do electric charging stations. And he said they put a station in a mall, and he said the station used more power than the entire mall.
Oh my goodness!
Just to give you an idea. So you can't just put you go out to a dealer out in the middle of Kansas and say put in a EV charger. That is no trivial task
Or cheap task.
Yeah. Well, he told me it's about 1.6 million if you have the power there. But if you have to get the utility to bring the power down, it could be millions more. And then you have to commit to buying the power once they bring it.
And then you need cars
Then you
to
need
plug in.
Then you actually.
Yeah.
Then you probably need to
Right.
sell a lot of beef jerky and Slurpees.
That's right.
Things like that to sort of
Bar-
amortize some of the costs.
Barbecue sandwiches are big. Yeah.
Right. But that's why EVs are not going to catch on in those rural regions or more remote regions. I mean, it's very obvious where EVs are catching on. And that's where the utilities are hyper focused on this. They know all these issues. In fact, I saw a presentation from EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute. They've developed a simulation of the United States where they can see real-time electric use by state, by county, by city. And so just by looking at this simulation, they can see exactly where they've got to put in electric chargers for EVs and then figure out the substations and everything else that goes on with it. And I think it's a brilliant tool that's been created here. And so the point I'm making is, the grid is not ready for everyone to go electric. But guess what? It's not going to go all electric overnight. It's going to take a decade and a half.
You need a strategy. Somebody has to have the energy department. We need an energy policy that has a strategy.
But I'll tell you what the biggest thing that they talked about, permitting and regulation. They said that is the biggest problem. The technology, we know how to do this. But to get the permits and go through government regulations, not federal necessarily, but state and local, they said that's the nightmare that they're dealing with.
Even I've heard even just the on the ground licensed electricians, commercial to handle that, can do the work is a real, because it's all over the place, so.
Scott, does a software defined vehicle need to be an electric vehicle?
Absolutely not. No, that was talked about at the conference this morning too, which is really interesting. No, all the benefits we talked about would apply to ICE. However, there was a point made I thought was quite clever, which was it's even more beneficial to an EV. Because an EV, by its very nature, is digitally controlled, the electric motors, and so your precision of control with the software on an EV is better than the chemistry and combustion that goes on with an ICE. But still, the issue we talked about with the current architecture on ICE, unsustainable. You got to move to SDV.
Where's this going to leave suppliers? Because as you know, they give the black boxes with all the software that they've developed. And now if you listen to what Doug Field is saying, it's just going to be build to spec and ship. You don't have to do anything else but build to our spec.
Build to print. And well, it's an interesting phenomena because some of that work's being kind of sucked out of the tier one into the OEM, but then you've got the Googles and the Android that are kind of sucking content out of the OEM to the cloud and to the tech industry. So there's the head of software for BMW, I can't remember his name right now, but he was talking about a partnership between the silicon, because they're putting software on their chips too, right? The NVIDIAs and the Qualcomms of the world, phenomenal companies. The cloud companies, the Azures and the AWS and the tier ones have to all work together to, with the OEM to deliver that. But yeah, it'll be an interesting follow, John. I don't know the answer to where this leaves the tier ones.
But how much of a payment does Bosch get for every can in every single vehicle? I mean, potentially that's all going to go away, right?
I think the suppliers would say, yeah, we'll see.
Well,
right?
that's what they are saying,
That's
because I've
what they'll
asked them
say.
this.
I've talked to some of them, and they're they're skeptical, and it will take a while. But yeah, that's it.
And they can point to battery production. Remember, we're going to vertically integrate everything.
Yeah.
We're going to get mineral mines, right? We're going to get it all in house.
Yeah.
And now what's the strategy?
But the big ones like Bosch, I think that they can do full systems. I know some programs in defense that they do, and they'll still do that. They'll be the owner of the SUV in those applications. But the landscape's going to change. I think it's a decade, over the next decade, I would say, that transition will happen. But where it lands will be interesting.
Yeah.
How much of this is predicated on, we were talking earlier about people willing to pay for something. And so it would seem to me that, okay, if I have a software-defined vehicle and it's like my phone, okay, so my phone is periodically getting new updates to the apps that are on it, right? And by and large, I pay nothing for these things. They just show up.
Yeah.
But it would seem to me that the car companies are going to want something for that. They're not going to say, we'll just send him stuff and his car will be more modern. And this will mean he won't need to buy a new one, which is certainly not in their best interests. So how does the willingness of the consumer to pay for updates make software-defined vehicles a reality?
I think that's a dimension, but again, I mean that there's a huge revenue opportunity, but we talked earlier about, who are you going to, because you might just say, well, wait a minute, I bought this car and that's just simple. I think if it's a truly incremental new thing that you never had before, or let's say you want high res audio, right? Like I had the privilege of working with the Neil Young. And he came in and we talked about, he said, the artists are very, when you put this music on your phone, the artist's true intent doesn't come through. And, so these audiophiles who are passionate about it. And if you offered that, you said, hey, for another $9.99 a month, or I don't know, $1.99 a month, you could have high res, they might pay it. But if you come in and say, yeah, well, your car's a tenth faster than 0 to 60, no, I don't think so. But I still don't, the value of SDV is in that whole reduction of complexity, quality, brand reputation, updatability too. So even if that didn't pay, but I think it can, you'd still want to go there.
So what else you got, Gary? News-wise.
Basically that's it. But we've got Keith here. He knows all about things that are going on.
Well, I guess we talked a little bit earlier, and it's kind of permeated the conversation about the EV slowdown. But how long will we be in this EV winter, do you think, Scott? What will trigger finally mass adoption?
Well, there's a obviously I don't know, because if I did, I'd have all kinds of
run out and buy it.
things to do. But no, I'm just kidding. For example, I don't know if you guys read the article. Hertz sold off a third of their fleet, and the reason they did it was because the upkeep and the expense was kind of becoming unmanageable. And I think it is just what you said. I think it's a bit of a winner. You know how we go. The pendulum swings. Everybody's all in. It's the newest, hottest thing. It's come back a bit. It'll swing back the other way. As John keeps saying, in 3 years, the tech will all cycle. But the industry is pulling out. We just talked about it. The big OEMs are pulling investment out, and the startups are taking headcount out. So they're investing less. The big battery plants are slowing down. So
I think the key will be the second half of this year. Because when you look at, products coming from General Motors, from Honda, electric vehicles I'm talking about, that's when I expect the pendulum to start to swing
that
back.
fast, huh?
Well, I'm not saying it's going to go back to the rate that we saw a year and a half ago. But, remember, 1.1 million EVs were sold in the U.S. last year.
Right.
That's a significant amount. Now the question is, what's it going to be this year? Is it going to be 1.3 million, 1.5 million, 1.7 million? Those are the ranges of estimates that I've seen. And even if it's at the low end, 1.3 million. I mean, 1.1 last year, 1.3 million this year. there's still market demand out for
What's
there.
the SAR these days, John? I don't track it
SAR
anymore.
right now, they're talking 15.8.
Yeah, so
15.8 million.
once I think EVs crack like 10%.
But will they?
Well,
They were 7.8 last year, and there are now analysts saying that Tesla will sell fewer cars this year than it did last year.
right.
And if Tesla sells fewer cars this year, there are fewer EV sales
Yeah,
in the
for
United
sure, yeah.
States. There's still more than 3/4 of the market. So as goes Tesla in the United States, so goes the U.S.
Right.
EV market.
Well, and I think the first half of this year is going to be real slow.
Mhm.
But I believe when you see all this new product coming in the second half of the year, that's when I think we're going to see the rate of increase start growing again.
You know, one that's a watcher is Hyundai, because they really have done some very smart EVs. And they were talking this week about how their view of things are, whatever your view of Kia and Hyundai has been in the past, doesn't matter. Clean slate on EVs. You know, we can redefine ourselves with our EVs. And they haven't gone, well, they have gone with Genesis some high end, but they are aiming more middle of the market.
Well, not completely. You know, if pre-COVID you had said to me, you know, in just a few years, Kia will be selling $60,000, $50,000 cars, and people will be lining up to buy them, I would have said, you're nuts.
Right.
But they are.
They are.
And they've
Tell you
used this
right.
EV move to really boost their image.
There's parallels between Hyundai Group
Mhm.
and BYD. Go hire some fabulous European designers and have them come and design your cars, make them look beautiful, give them beautiful interiors, still price them like we've been pricing them, or maybe a little bit higher, but not much, still undercutting the competition. And they come,
Voila.
you know? So, and now they just feel like they have this opportunity with electrified vehicles to you know, blaze a new path for themselves.
Is it true? I read that even Europe, which surprised me, that said that Europe could be a target for the Chinese
Already is.
EVs
Yeah, they're in there.
as well. And
Already is. In
But-
fact, you know, look, the Chinese are taking over the world, really, automotive world. And we don't see it in this country because things are tight between the U.S. or, you know, tense, I should say, between the U.S. and China. But I mean, go to Latin America. Chinese cars are everywhere. Go to, you know, Africa, the Middle East, and now increasingly Europe. And that's why you're hearing a growing chorus of voices in Europe saying, hey, we got to stop these guys.
Mhm.
But it's going to be hard to do because the Chinese are talking about investing in Europe, building plants in Europe. You know, what have we reported? Italy and Spain are soon going to have Chinese automakers building cars in there. And it's going to be very difficult for governments to say no to that kind of investment in jobs.
yeah, we work a little bit with the Saudi Wealth Fund, or you know, not work with, but have some connections. And they were telling me that the Crown Prince has 100-year plan, you know, for the I mean, and he's in year 12 of a 100-year plan. And when you can think on that kind of a level, you know, so if things go south for them for 5 or 6 years, as long as it's good in 20, then I'm fine, right? I mean, think about the quarterly profit mindset we have. So I guess my point is, I think the Chinese, with China first, they're out there expanding, and they don't have to make big money doing it. They're willing to take the hit to gain the share, to gain the presence, to gain the brand acceptance. You know, you guys know first the Japanese cars, then the Korean cars. The Chinese are right behind them. So I think, you know, those kind of long-term strategies are always going to be successful compared to some of this very tactical stuff.
And
we
the
do.
Chinese EVs struggled for years. I mean, they started this whole push 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And they did not have a lot of success in the early years. But then when Tesla came to China, that sort of changed their worldview. And suddenly they were building wonderful electric vehicles that were desirable.
Yeah.
I'm all for long-term thinking, but we don't know what's going to happen next year. And, you know, so I think it's good to have a long-term plan. 100 years, I mean, come on. You know, did people in 1924 figure out where we should be by this point, you know, 100 years ago? Hell no, they
Wouldn't
had
even
no
wanted
clue.
them to, right?
So I take these 100-year plans, even 50-year plans, you know, with a grain of salt.
for sure.
A 10-year plan, you bet. I think you can have a pretty good idea of where things are going, but look what's happened with AV investment and EV investment in just the last 12 months. It's gone, completely upside down. And so I think you need a mixture of the both. You need that, quick response kind of agility to go which way the market's going. But I do agree. You need to have a longer term view.
But my pushback is I bet you the Chinese aren't slowing down their EV investment.
No,
I bet their foot is on the gas, no pun intended.
Correct. But then we get back to the government subsidies and
yeah, that's right.
low cost loans, free land, a whole bunch of other things where you don't have to worry about the bottom line. Because look, if you look at a lot of Chinese companies, the only way that they're surviving is government handouts. And that's, largely with, the large city governments because they need those jobs. And so,
the other thing forcing them to is they have huge overcapacity in China.
Correct.
So they have got to have a very robust export strategy.
And they do.
But that's bringing them even faster to our shores.
Well, a lot of those companies even have state ownership.
Right.
At least in part, if not entirely.
But think about it. To your point, Keith, this year Germany will build around 4 million vehicles. This year China will export 6 million. So they're exporting 50% more than Germany can produce. That's a lot.
Up from practically nothing 5 years ago.
Correct. That's right.
Incredible.
It is.
Hell of a business to be in, huh?
Right.
Great work.
Which is why we have these shows, to try to figure out where's this going and what do people in the industry need to be thinking about and what should be on their horizon? Where should they be going? Because, just to stick your head in the sand and not talk about these things is going to leave you in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And so are your clients talking about these same sorts of things? Is this the focus?
Yes, some of them are. They're very keenly aware of the Chinese threat, without a doubt. Not, some of the tier ones and some of the other non-automotive less so. But absolutely, it's a concern. Yeah.
Is it hair on fire concern or is it a?
No,
we've faced this before.
No, it's not casual, but it's not hair on fire. We're going to have some challenging times ahead, and we got to rise to the occasion.
And Scott, do you feel like that? I mean, the Chinese have been trying to dominate EVs, as I said, for a very long time. But do you feel like we've really seen a step change in the awareness of this in the last, 18 months?
Oh, years? I think so. Yeah, but you guys tell me. We have these same. There was a book written. I was in MBA school. That's how long ago it was. It was a book called "The Japan That Can't Say No." I don't know if you. Right. And we have these same hair on fire, the Japanese are taking over the world and today we sit and they're our strongest ally and trade partner and they make good products and we seem to be copacetic, even commercially, not just. So are we going to be doing the same with China? I don't know.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
I hope we in China get along famously and are great allies. Right.
Yeah. That's not where we're at right now.
But you have to. But I would say the Japanese were never they were never unfair to this degree, in how they approached the commercial work. But time will tell.
That's right. Hey, look, we got to wrap this up, but. Scott, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Keith, always good to have you on the show.
Fun. Thanks for having me on.
And Gary, you and I will do this again next week.
Next week, Merrick Masters.
Merrick Masters. We're going to talk a lot about the UAW because we'll know the Volkswagen vote by then and where this is all going. I want to thank all of you for having tuned in.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey.